Thursday evening, March 17, 2022. A quiet residential street in Pilsen, Chicago. Inside a modest two-story home, 38-year-old Tanisha Morrison was doing what she'd done 1,000 times before, preparing dinner for her two children, 9-year-old Marcus and 7-year-old Zoe. Chicken frying on the stove. Homework spread across the kitchen table. The kind of ordinary moment that makes up a life. In exactly 47 minutes, Agent Marcus Rivera would make what federal investigators would later call the worst violation of civil rights in ICE's recent history. A mistake that would cost him his career, his reputation, and his freedom. A mistake that would result in one of the largest civil rights settlements in Illinois state history, $16.7 million. But here's what makes this story different from so many others we've covered. Tanisha Morrison wasn't just going to be another victim of racial profiling, another casualty of an out-of-control system. She wasn't just going to accept an apology and move on. She was going to make sure that what happened to her in front of her terrified children would never happen to another family again. Because Agent Rivera had made a critical miscalculation. He'd looked at this black woman in her own kitchen and seen someone he could intimidate, someone without power, someone who would just comply. He had no idea who she really was, and by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late. Before we go any further, quick question: where are you watching from? We've been seeing incredible growth from viewers in Atlanta, Houston, Memphis, and DC, and we want to make sure we're covering the stories that matter to your community. Drop your city in the comments, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We focus on cases where justice actually wins, where accountability actually happens. The algorithm doesn't always show you content like this, so subscribing helps us reach more people who need to see these stories. Now, back to Tanisha Morrison. Who exactly was this woman that Agent Rivera had just confronted in her own home? Dr. Tanisha Morrison. That's the full name. The one he'd see on the lawsuit papers soon enough. She'd earned her doctorate in civil rights law from Northwestern University in 2014. Spent 3 years as a public defender in Cook County, handling over 200 cases, winning 73% of them, an exceptional record in a system where the deck is stacked against defendants. In 2018, she'd moved to the Illinois Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, where she specialized in, and here's the beautiful irony, federal misconduct cases. Cases involving police brutality, illegal searches, violations of constitutional rights. For the past 18 months, she'd been working on a massive investigation into ICE enforcement practices in the Chicago area. She knew the law better than most federal agents ever would. She knew her rights. She knew the limits of ICE authority. She knew every single mistake an agent could make during an enforcement action, and she had a photographic memory for policy violations. But on this particular Thursday evening, she wasn't Dr. Morrison, civil rights attorney with the state. She was just a mom trying to get dinner on the table before her kids' bedtime. She'd picked them up from their after-school program at 4:30 p.m., stopped at the grocery store for chicken thighs, rice, and green beans, got home at 5:15 p.m., changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt, the same school her parents had attended in the 1970s, the same school where her grandmother had marched with students during the civil rights movement. She'd been breading the chicken when her doorbell rang at 6:03 p.m. She'd thought it was her neighbor returning the mixing bowl she'd borrowed last week. Instead, she opened the door to find Agent Marcus Rivera, 34 years old, 5 years with ICE, standing on her porch with his hand resting on his service weapon. "Are you Tanisha Morrison?" he'd asked, mispronouncing her last name as Moore-E-Son instead of Morrison. "Yes, can I help you?" That's when he'd pushed past her, walking uninvited into her home, without a warrant, without probable cause, without any legal authority whatsoever. And that's when this ordinary Thursday evening became the beginning of the end of his career. Agent Rivera crossed the threshold of Tanisha's home at 6:04 p.m. No warrant, no court order, no exigent circumstances. Under the Fourth Amendment, this was already a constitutional violation. Strike one. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Rivera with Immigration and Customs Enforcement," he announced, standing in her living room. "We've received information that you may be residing in the United States illegally." Tanisha, still holding the raw chicken she'd been about to bread, felt her attorney brain activate. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd prosecuted cases like this. "I'm a U.S. citizen," she said calmly. "Born at Rush University Medical Center, Chicago, Illinois, February 3, 1984. I need you to leave my home immediately. You have no warrant." "I don't need a warrant," Rivera said, his voice aggressive, dismissive. ICE has broad authority to investigate immigration violations. No, you don't. Tanisha's voice remained steady, though her children had now appeared from the living room. Marcus, 9 years old, holding his math homework. Zoe, 7, clutching her stuffed bear. ICE has limited authority. You cannot enter a private residence without consent, a warrant, or exigent circumstances. You have none of those things. I'm an attorney with the Illinois Attorney General's office, and I'm telling you that you're currently violating federal law. For just a moment, something flickered across Rivera's face. Uncertainty. But then, his jaw set. Pride. Later in the investigation, we'd learned Rivera's supervisors had repeatedly noted his difficulty accepting correction and tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. He'd been passed over for promotion twice. Both evaluation reports cited the same issue: inability to de-escalate, inability to admit mistakes, inability to back down. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your documentation," he said, ignoring everything she'd told him. "And I'm going to need you to step away from your children until we can verify your status." "Step away from my children?" Tanisha's voice rose slightly. "Are you serious right now?" That's when Marcus spoke up. "Mom, what's happening? Is he arresting you?" "No, baby, he's not." "Ma'am, I need you to be quiet and comply," Rivera interrupted. "Your kids don't need to see you make this difficult." Agent Rivera had now entered an American citizen's home without legal authority, refused to leave when asked, violated her Fourth Amendment rights, and was threatening to separate her from her children based on absolutely nothing. During the federal investigation, prosecutors would uncover how this started. A different family in the neighborhood, the Garcias, had been served with a deportation notice. They'd hired an attorney named Tanisha Martinez. Rivera mixed up the names. He'd looked up Tanisha Morrison instead, seen her address in the Pilsen neighborhood, made assumptions, and decided to conduct a compliance check. He'd never verified anything, never checked citizenship records, never confirmed he had the right person. He'd seen a name, seen an address in a heavily Latino neighborhood, assumed she was undocumented, and showed up to flex his authority. Racial profiling. Pure and simple. "I want your supervisor's name and badge number," Tanisha said, her voice hardening into the tone she used in courtrooms. "You've already violated my Fourth Amendment rights by entering without a warrant. You've violated IC's own enforcement protocols. You're currently detaining me without probable cause, and you're doing all of this in front of my minor children." "Lady, I don't care what you think your rights are," Rivera cut her off. "Right now, you need to show me identification, or I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction." Arrest? For obstruction? In her own home? For refusing an illegal order from an agent who had no legal right to be there? Tanisha looked at her children, looked at this agent, and made a decision. She was going to comply, for now, to keep her kids safe. But she was also going to remember every single word, every single violation, every single moment. And Agent Rivera was going to pay for all of it. "Fine," Tanisha said. "My purse is in the kitchen. My Illinois driver's license and my passport are in my wallet. May I get them?" "Slowly," Rivera said, his hand still hovering near his service weapon. Tanisha walked to the kitchen, her children following close behind, scared and confused. She retrieved her purse, pulled out her wallet, and extracted both her driver's license and U.S. passport. The passport she'd used last summer to take her kids to visit her grandmother in Jamaica. She handed both documents to Rivera. He examined them for a long moment, his expression changing as he realized what he was looking at. But here's where his pride became his downfall. A reasonable person would have apologized and left. Agent Marcus Rivera was not a reasonable person. "These could be fake," he said, looking at a valid U.S. passport, one of the most secure documents in the world, and claiming it could be fake. "Are you kidding me right now?" Tanisha's voice was no longer calm. "That is a valid U.S. passport. You can verify it right now. Call your supervisor. Run my information." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." There it was, the phrase that's gotten so many officers in trouble. "Calm down," said to a woman being perfectly reasonable while her rights were violated in front of her children. "I want your badge number," Tanisha said clearly. "I'm filing a formal complaint. You've detained me without cause for 12 minutes. You're in my home illegally. You're threatening to separate me from my children. And you're suggesting my valid passport is fraudulent. Give me your badge number." Rivera's jaw clenched, his face reddened. Later, in his deposition, he'd claim he felt threatened and disrespected. A federal civil rights attorney in her own home, asking for his badge number, and he felt threatened. "Badge number 7421, he said finally. Then he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Rivera. I need backup at 1847 West 21st Street. I have a possibly hostile subject refusing to cooperate." Possibly hostile. That's what he called the woman standing in her own kitchen. Tanisha's son Marcus was crying now. Her daughter Zoe was asking over and over, "Mommy, are you going to jail?" And Tanisha was struggling to hold it together. But she was also still thinking like an attorney, counting violations, documenting the timeline. She reached for her cell phone. "I'm calling my supervisor," she told Rivera. "And I'm recording this encounter, which is my legal right under Illinois' one-party consent law." "Put the phone down," Rivera said sharply. "No, I have a right to record police activity in my own home." Before we continue, if you're shocked by what you're hearing, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is about to take turns you won't believe. Leave a comment. Have you or anyone you know ever dealt with ICE agents? We want to hear your stories. Rivera reached for Tanisha's phone. That was his third physical violation. He'd entered without permission. He'd now attempted to seize her property, and he was about to physically restrain her without legal authority. "Take your hands off me," Tanisha shouted as Rivera grabbed her wrist. That's when Marcus screamed, loud enough that the neighbors heard, loud enough that phones started coming out. Mr. Raymond Chen, 67, retired postal worker next door. He heard the scream, came to his window, and saw an ICE agent restraining a woman while children screamed. He immediately started recording. 7 minutes and 43 seconds that would become Exhibit A. Mrs. Adriana Gonzalez, 34, teacher across the street. She started recording as well. 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Exhibit B. And the doorbell camera. Tanisha's Ring doorbell captured everything from 6:04 p.m. onward. Audio and video proving he'd violated her rights from the first moment. At 6:18 p.m., 2 more ICE agents arrived, Agent Sarah Martinez and Agent James Davidson. They entered, again without a warrant, and found Rivera physically restraining Tanisha while her children sobbed. According to sworn depositions, Agent Martinez: "What's the situation?" Rivera: "Subject is refusing to comply. She's being combative and attempted to flee." Attempted to flee, in her own kitchen. Agent Davidson asked the right question. "Do we have a warrant?" "Compliance check," Rivera said. "We don't need a warrant." "Do we have supervisory approval for entry?" Silence from Rivera. "Marcus, what documentation have you verified?" Agent Martinez asked. Rivera held up Tanisha's documents. "Claims these are real." Agent Martinez took them, looked at Rivera. And you could see it in the doorbell footage, the moment she realized they'd all walked into a career-ending situation. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this is a valid U.S. passport." "Could be fake." "No. This has all the security features. This is real. She's a U.S. citizen. She could have obtained it fraudulently." "Marcus, stop." Agent Martinez's voice was firm. "This woman is a U.S. citizen. We're in her home without a warrant. We need to leave, now." But the damage was done. 2 children who would need therapy for years. A woman assaulted in her own home. 3 agents who'd followed Rivera into a civil rights violation. Neighbors who'd recorded everything. "We're not leaving until I verify her status through the system," Rivera said. That's when Tanisha's phone rang. She'd managed to text her supervisor before Rivera tried to take her phone. "ICE agent in my home, no warrant, won't leave, help." The person calling was Karen Williams, Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights, State of Illinois, and she was about to make Agent Rivera's very bad day even worse. Tanisha answered the phone on speaker. "This is Tanisha Morrison." "Dr. Morrison, this is Deputy A.G. Williams. What's your situation?" "I have 3 ICE agents in my home, no warrant. They entered without permission at 6:04 p.m. Agent Rivera has physically restrained me and is refusing to leave despite being shown my valid U.S. passport. My children are here. They're terrified." There was a brief pause, and then Deputy A.G. Williams' voice came through, and every agent in that room knew immediately that this situation had just escalated beyond anything they were prepared to handle. "This is Deputy Attorney General Karen Williams of the State of Illinois. To the ICE agents present, you are currently in violation of the 4th Amendment. You are in violation of ICE's own enforcement protocols. You are committing assault and unlawful detention of a state employee. I am ordering you to leave Dr. Morrison's residence immediately. Be advised that I am currently on another line with U.S. Attorney James Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, and with Director Linda Chen of the Chicago ICE Field Office. You have 30 seconds to exit the premises, or you will face immediate arrest by Chicago PD, who I have already dispatched to the location. The silence in that kitchen was absolute. Agent Davidson was already moving toward the door. Agent Martinez started to follow. But Rivera still couldn't let it go. Ma'am, with all due respect to your office, ICE has federal authority. Agent, I'm going to stop you right there. Deputy A.G. Williams' voice was ice cold now. You have no federal authority to enter a private citizen's home without a warrant, without consent, and without exigent circumstances. You have no authority to detain a U.S. citizen without probable cause. You have no authority to physically restrain someone in their own home when they're not committing a crime. Federal authority doesn't mean you get to violate the Constitution. Now get out of Dr. Morrison's home before I add felony charges to the civil rights violations you're already facing. Through the doorbell camera, you could see Chicago PD pulling up outside. 2 squad cars, lights flashing, officers approaching the house. Finally, Agent Rivera released Tanisha's wrist. She immediately went to her children, pulling them close, comforting them while they cried. Agent Martinez was already outside, talking rapidly to the Chicago police officers, trying to explain what had happened, trying to minimize the damage. Agent Davidson was standing in the doorway, looking like he wanted to disappear. Rivera pulled out his notepad, and this is the part that would stun investigators later. He actually started writing notes for his report. In his mind, he was still documenting a legitimate enforcement action. He actually believed he'd done nothing wrong. Even with Chicago PD in front of the house, even with a deputy attorney general on the phone, even with 3 civilians worth of cell phone video, he thought he could write this up as a routine compliance check with an uncooperative subject. The delusion was remarkable. One of the Chicago police officers, Officer Maria Santos, entered the home. 20-year veteran, recognized Tanisha immediately from community events. Dr. Morrison, are you okay? Are your kids okay? We're not hurt, Tanisha said, though her voice was shaking now. The adrenaline was wearing off. But I need these agents removed from my property, and I need documentation of everything that happened here. Officer Santos turned to Rivera. Agent, I need you to step outside. This is a federal matter. Step outside, now, or I will arrest you for trespassing. Finally, at 6:34 p.m., 30 minutes after he'd first pushed his way into Tanisha Morrison's home, Agent Marcus Rivera left. But not before he made one final, catastrophic mistake. As he walked past Tanisha on his way out, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You should be grateful we're letting you stay in this country." Letting her stay. In the country where she was born. The country where her parents were born. The country where her grandmother had marched for civil rights when Rivera's own parents were still children. Officer Santos heard it. Agent Martinez heard it. Agent Davidson heard it. The doorbell camera recorded it. And Tanisha Morrison, civil rights attorney, state employee, U.S. citizen, mother, she heard it too. And she would never, ever forget it. What Agent Rivera didn't know, as he walked to his government vehicle and drove away, was that his career had just ended. He just didn't know it yet. By 8:00 p.m. that night, less than 2 hours after Rivera left Tanisha's home, the situation had exploded far beyond anything a typical ICE incident would generate. Director Linda Chen of the Chicago ICE Field Office had pulled Rivera's personnel file. What she found was stunning. This wasn't his first incident. It wasn't even his second. In his 5 years with ICE, Agent Marcus Rivera had been the subject of 7 formal complaints. 7. For excessive force, for unlawful entry, for racial profiling, for failure to follow protocols. Every single complaint had been filed by Black or Latino individuals. Every single one had been dismissed after cursory internal investigations. 2 of those complaints had included allegations that Rivera falsified reports to justify his actions. One had involved a family in Aurora, where Rivera had entered a home without a warrant and detained a U.S. citizen for 3 hours before confirming their status. That family had tried to sue, but they couldn't afford an attorney and eventually gave up. But Tanisha Morrison wasn't going to give up. She didn't need to find an attorney. She was an attorney, and she had resources they didn't have. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after the incident, Tanisha had filed a formal complaint with the Office of Inspector General. By Friday afternoon, she'd filed a complaint with the Department of Homeland Security Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office. By Monday morning, she'd filed a lawsuit in federal court. Morrison v. Rivera, United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Homeland Security. The lawsuit was 47 pages long. It detailed every constitutional violation, every ICE protocol violation, every state law violation. It cited 23 previous federal cases establishing the standards Rivera had violated. It included transcripts from the doorbell camera audio. It included witness statements from 3 neighbors who'd recorded the incident. It included frame-by-frame analysis of Rivera's actions from 3 different camera angles. But the real weapon was Section 4 of the complaint. Pattern and practice of constitutional violations. Tanisha had used her access to state records to identify 17 other cases where Agent Rivera had been complained about, cases that had never made it into his official file, cases that had been buried, cases that had been dismissed without investigation. She'd tracked down 12 of those families. 8 of them were willing to provide sworn declarations about what Rivera had done to them. The media coverage was immediate and explosive. ICE agent detains civil rights attorney in her own home. State official held without cause while children watch. Federal investigation launched after wrong home raid. But here's what made this different from so many other stories we cover. Tanisha didn't just want an apology. She didn't just want Rivera fired. She wanted systemic change. Her lawsuit included demands for mandatory constitutional rights training for all ICE agents in the Chicago field office, independent oversight of ICE enforcement actions in residential settings, a civilian review board with authority to investigate ICE misconduct complaints, public reporting of all internal investigations into ICE agent conduct, criminal prosecution of agents who knowingly violate civil rights, and monetary damages, significant enough to send a message that constitutional violations have consequences. She was asking for $5 million in compensatory damages and $10 million in punitive damages, $15 million total, a number big enough to make the federal government pay attention. Rivera's attorney would later argue that she was being vindictive, that she was using her position to go after a federal agent who'd made an honest mistake. But Judge Sarah Martinez, no relation to Agent Martinez, would shut that argument down in court. This was not an honest mistake, Judge Martinez would say during a pretrial hearing. This was a pattern of deliberate constitutional violations by an agent who believed his badge gave him unlimited authority. Dr. Morrison is not being vindictive. She is seeking accountability for violations that have been ignored for far too long. And she was going to get it. The first domino fell 6 days after the incident. On March 23, 2022, Agent Marcus Rivera was placed on administrative leave. Not because ICE wanted to investigate, they'd ignored 7 previous complaints, but because U.S. Attorney James Morrison had opened a federal criminal investigation. 3 weeks later, CNN ran Civil Rights in Crisis, when federal agents violate the Constitution. They interviewed Tanisha, her children's faces blurred. 9 million people watched. It trended on Twitter for 48 hours. Politicians started asking questions. In April, the Office of Inspector General released preliminary findings. The report was damning. They'd found systemic failures in oversight, inadequate training on constitutional rights, and a culture that discouraged reporting misconduct. Supervisors had been actively dismissing complaints against Rivera to avoid documentation that might trigger formal investigation. Everyone had known. They'd all known Rivera was violating people's rights, and they'd looked the other way because investigating would have been inconvenient. But the game changer came in May. The Chicago Tribune published The Disappeared Complaints: How ICE Buries Evidence of Agent Misconduct. Their reporters had tracked down people who'd tried to file complaints, found cases closed without investigation, documented a pattern of violations that had been systematically ignored. They'd identified 37 cases in Chicago alone over 5 years, 37 families who'd experienced unlawful entries, illegal detentions, excessive force, racial profiling, 37 complaints that went nowhere. And Rivera had been the subject of 11 of them, not 7 as his file showed. 4 complaints had been removed by supervisors. The coverage was relentless. 60 Minutes investigated. The New York Times wrote 3 editorials calling for ICE reform. Senator Dick Durbin called for congressional hearings. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for criminal prosecutions. Before we continue, if this story is making you angry, if you're thinking about all the times you've heard similar stories that never got justice, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases where accountability actually happens. Drop a comment if you think we need more oversight of federal law enforcement. But the headlines couldn't capture the trauma Tanisha and her children lived with every day. Marcus, 9 years old, started having nightmares. He'd wake up screaming, convinced agents were coming for his mother. He struggled in school, unable to concentrate, grades dropping. His teacher reported he'd become withdrawn, anxious around anyone in uniform, police, security guards, even the school crossing guard. Zoe, 7, developed separation anxiety. She couldn't be apart from Tanisha without panic attacks. She'd cry uncontrollably at school drop-off. She refused to sleep alone. For 3 months, she slept in Tanisha's bed every night, terrified her mother would be gone when she woke up. Tanisha herself started therapy twice a week. The woman who'd spent years as a civil rights attorney, who'd seen countless cases of injustice, she'd learned that experiencing it yourself, in front of your children, in your own home, was entirely different. She'd taken 2 weeks off work, couldn't focus, couldn't sleep. Every sound at the door made her heart race. She installed 3 additional security cameras, changed her phone number, even briefly considered moving, though she refused to let Rivera force her from her neighborhood. But she also did something else. She reached out to all 37 families the Tribune had identified. She offered to represent them pro bono. She offered to help them file lawsuits, to seek accountability, to make sure this wouldn't happen again. 8 families agreed. By June 2022, there were 9 federal lawsuits filed against ICE and the Chicago field office. 9 families who'd been silent, who'd felt powerless, who now had a champion with resources and knowledge to fight back. The system that had protected these agents for years was about to collapse. On June 15, 2022, exactly 3 months after Agent Rivera had pushed his way into Tanisha Morrison's home, U.S. Attorney James Morrison made an announcement that shocked federal law enforcement agencies nationwide. Agent Marcus Rivera was being charged with 4 federal crimes: deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Secor 242, for violating Tanisha's Fourth Amendment rights through unlawful entry and detention; assault under federal jurisdiction, 18 U.S.C. Secor 111, for physically restraining Tanisha without legal authority; falsifying federal records, 18 U.S.C. Secor 1001, for writing a false report claiming Tanisha had been hostile and had attempted to flee; criminal trespass under Illinois state law, being prosecuted federally due to the federal agent's involvement. This was extraordinary. Federal agents are almost never criminally prosecuted for actions taken during their official duties. The system is designed to protect them, to give them qualified immunity, to make prosecution nearly impossible. But U.S. Attorney Morrison, who'd built his career on civil rights cases, had reviewed the evidence and concluded that what Rivera had done wasn't just a mistake or poor judgment. It was criminal conduct. The trial was set for September 2022. But before we get there, we need to talk about the civil lawsuit, because that's where the real reckoning happened. Morrison v. Rivera was assigned to Judge Sarah Martinez, who'd been on the federal bench for 12 years and had a reputation for not tolerating constitutional violations. The government's lawyers tried to get the case dismissed, arguing that Rivera had qualified immunity, that he'd been acting in his official capacity, that he'd made a reasonable mistake. Judge Martinez rejected every argument in a 23-page opinion that legal scholars would later call a masterclass in Fourth Amendment law. She wrote, "When a federal agent enters a private home without a warrant, without consent, and without exigent circumstances, he is not acting in his official capacity. He is acting as a criminal. When that agent then physically detains a citizen who has shown valid proof of citizenship, he is not making a reasonable mistake. He is committing assault. Qualified immunity does not protect agents who knowingly violate clearly established constitutional rights." The case moved to discovery. Tanisha's legal team, she'd brought in 3 other civil rights attorneys to help her, subpoenaed Rivera's complete personnel file, all internal communications about complaints against him, all training records, all supervision logs. What they found was even worse than they'd expected. Rivera's supervisors had known about his pattern of misconduct. They'd known, and they'd actively covered it up. One email, from a supervisor named David Chen to another supervisor named Linda Wong, said explicitly, "We need to make sure the complaint files stay thin on Rivera. If OIG starts looking, we can't have documentation showing we knew about a pattern." That email, dated April 2021, 11 months before Rivera entered Tanisha's home, became Exhibit A in proving that the entire Chicago field office shared liability for what had happened. By August 2022, the Department of Justice was in settlement negotiations. Not because they wanted to settle, but because they knew that going to trial with that email on the record would be catastrophic. If a jury saw supervisors actively conspiring to hide an agent's misconduct, the verdict could easily exceed $20 million. Tanisha's attorneys were asking for $15 million, $5 million in compensatory damages for the trauma inflicted on her and her children, and $10 million in punitive damages to send a message about systemic reform. The government offered $3 million. Tanisha refused. She wasn't negotiating. This wasn't about money, though the money mattered, would matter for her children's future therapy, for their college funds, for their security. This was about forcing acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't acceptable, wasn't tolerable, wasn't going to be quietly settled and forgotten. If you believe that sometimes standing firm matters more than taking the easy way out, if you believe that accountability requires real consequences, hit that like button. We need stories like this to reach more people, and your engagement helps make that happen. The government came back at $5 million. Tanisha refused. Back to $7 million. Refused. At $10 million, her co-counsel started pushing her to accept. $10 million was an enormous settlement for a case where nobody was physically injured. But Tanisha held firm. She'd asked for 15, and 15 sent a message that 10 didn't. Meanwhile, Rivera's criminal trial was starting. September 12, 2022. Federal courthouse in Chicago. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution presented the doorbell camera footage, the neighbor recordings, the witness testimony, the children's therapists who described the trauma. They presented Rivera's false report. They presented the 7 previous complaints. They presented expert testimony about ICE protocols and constitutional law. Rivera's defense attorney argued that he'd been following his training, that he'd made a judgment call, that Tanisha had been confrontational. But when the prosecution played the doorbell camera audio, Rivera saying, "You should be grateful we're letting you stay in this country," to a U.S. citizen born in Chicago, the jury's expressions changed. You could see it. That wasn't training. That wasn't a judgment call. That was contempt. That was racism. That was an agent who saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On September 22, 2022, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all 4 counts. Rivera showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His wife, sitting in the gallery, started crying. Tanisha, sitting across the aisle, closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The first step toward accountability had been achieved. Sentencing was set for November. The prosecution was asking for the maximum, 10 years in federal prison. On November 3, 2022, Judge Sarah Martinez delivered Agent Marcus Rivera's sentence in a courtroom packed with media, ICE officials, civil rights advocates, and 8 of the families whose complaints against Rivera had been buried for years. "Agent Rivera," Judge Martinez began, "you violated your oath of office. You violated the Constitution. You violated the trust placed in you by the American people. You traumatized innocent children. And when given multiple opportunities to stop, to admit your mistake, to de-escalate, you chose instead to double down on your abuse of power. This court will not tolerate such conduct." The sentence, 7 years in federal prison. Not the 10 the prosecution had asked for, but far more than the 2 years Rivera's attorney had requested. 7 years in federal prison for a federal agent who thought his badge made him untouchable. But the consequences didn't stop there. 5 days later, on November 8, the Department of Justice announced a settlement in Morrison v. Rivera. The final amount, $16.7 million. Tanisha had held firm, and the government had blinked. $5 million in compensatory damages, $11.7 million in punitive damages, one of the largest civil rights settlements in Illinois history. But the settlement included more than money. It included mandatory reforms. Every ICE agent in the Chicago field office would undergo 80 hours of constitutional rights training, conducted by outside civil rights experts, not ICE trainers. A civilian oversight board with subpoena power would be established to investigate ICE misconduct complaints. All ICE enforcement actions in residential settings would require supervisory approval and documentation. All misconduct complaints would be forwarded to the Office of Inspector General within 24 hours, no exceptions. Quarterly public reports on ICE enforcement actions and complaint investigations. Those reforms, those systemic changes, mattered more to Tanisha than the money ever could, because they meant that what had happened to her would be harder to repeat. But the consequences rippled even further. Director Linda Chen of the Chicago ICE field office resigned on November 15th. She'd been in charge when Rivera's complaints were being buried. She'd been in charge when supervisors were actively covering up misconduct. She'd lost credibility, lost trust, and lost her position. Supervisors David Chen and Linda Wong, The ones whose emails showed they'd been hiding Rivera's complaints were transferred to desk positions in Washington, D.C. Not fired, because federal employment protections make that nearly impossible, but effectively removed from any supervisory authority. The Chicago ICE field office underwent a complete reorganization. 12 agents were transferred out. 6 supervisors were replaced. New policies were implemented. And for the first time in years, agents in that office knew that misconduct would actually have consequences. Nationally, the impact was even broader. Senator Dick Durbin introduced the Federal Law Enforcement Accountability Act, legislation that would require independent oversight of all federal law enforcement agencies, create a national database of misconduct complaints, and eliminate qualified immunity for agents who knowingly violate constitutional rights. As of our last update, that bill was still working through committee, facing resistance from law enforcement unions, but gaining support from civil rights organizations nationwide. And Agent Marcus Rivera? He reported to federal prison on December 1, 2022. Federal Bureau of Prisons facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. 7 years. He'd be eligible for release in 2029, assuming good behavior. He'd lost his federal pension. He'd lost his law enforcement certification. He'd lost his marriage. His wife filed for divorce 3 weeks after his conviction. He'd lost everything. Some people would say that's too harsh, that he made a mistake, that he shouldn't lose his entire life for one bad decision. But here's the thing. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a pattern of decisions, year after year, victim after victim, violation after violation, protected by a system that didn't want to hold him accountable. And it took a woman who couldn't be intimidated, who had the knowledge and resources to fight back, to finally break that pattern. As for Tanisha Morrison, she took 6 months away from her regular work to focus on her family's healing. She used part of her settlement to establish a legal defense fund for families targeted by ICE misconduct, a fund that's helped 17 families file civil rights lawsuits as of early 2024. She became a national advocate for federal law enforcement reform, testifying before Congress twice, appearing on national news programs, writing op-eds about the need for accountability. And her children? Marcus and Zoe were still in therapy, still healing, but they were improving. Marcus's nightmares had become less frequent. Zoe could sleep in her own room again. They'd learned at far too young an age about injustice and power and the importance of fighting back. Their mother had shown them that even when the system tries to protect wrongdoing, accountability is possible if you refuse to give up. Here's what this story is really about. It's not just about one bad agent and one brave attorney. It's about a system that was designed to protect agents from accountability, that made it nearly impossible to hold federal law enforcement responsible for constitutional violations, that allowed patterns of abuse to continue year after year because investigating misconduct was inconvenient. Think about those 37 families in Chicago alone, 37 cases of agents violating rights that went nowhere. Think about how many other cities have similar patterns. Think about how many people experienced what Tanisha experienced, but didn't have the knowledge, the resources, or the platform to fight back. They complained, they tried, they were ignored. Tanisha Morrison's case succeeded because of who she was, a civil rights attorney with deep knowledge of the law, connections to powerful officials, and the financial stability to weather a long legal fight. But what about everyone else? What about the families who can't afford attorneys? What about immigrants who are afraid to file complaints because they fear retaliation? What about people who've been taught that fighting the system is futile? That's the bigger tragedy here. Tanisha won. She got justice. She got accountability. She got reforms. But she's the exception, not the rule. And that's what needs to change. The reforms that came out of this case matter. Mandatory training, civilian oversight, public reporting. These things make it harder for the next Marcus Rivera to hide behind his badge. But they're not enough. They're a start, but they're not enough. We need federal legislation that eliminates qualified immunity for agents who knowingly violate rights. We need independent prosecutors reviewing all federal agent misconduct. We need a national database so that agents like Rivera can't move from one field office to another with a clean file when their complaints have been buried. Most importantly, we need more people like Tanisha Morrison, people who refuse to accept that this is just how things are, people who fight back, people who demand accountability even when the system makes it as hard as possible. If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, document everything. Record when you can, get witness information, file complaints even when you think they'll be ignored. Because maybe your complaint won't go anywhere right now, but maybe it'll be part of a pattern that finally gets exposed. Maybe it'll be the piece of evidence that helps someone else's case. Maybe it'll be the thing that finally forces accountability. And if you're watching this as someone who's never experienced this kind of injustice yourself, understand that it's happening. Every day. All over the country. Federal agents, local police, authority figures who believe their badge gives them unlimited power. And until we create systems that hold them accountable, it's going to keep happening. Tanisha Morrison's children shouldn't have had to watch their mother being assaulted in their own home. Marcus Morrison shouldn't have nightmares about agents taking his mother away. Zoe Morrison shouldn't have developed separation anxiety so severe that she couldn't go to school. But they did. Because one agent decided his assumptions were more important than the Constitution, and the system that should have stopped him years earlier chose to protect him instead. The question is, what are we going to do about it? If this story made you angry, if it made you think, if it made you want to see more accountability in our justice system, you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel. We cover cases where justice actually happens, where accountability actually matters. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think needs to change. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And here's my question for you. Do you think 7 years was enough? Or should Agent Rivera have gotten the full 10? Let me know in the comments.